Chapter 34. North Carolina. After 7 years with no vacation, I took advantage of my situation and did nothing but spend time with my wife and kids. I also took some time to regroup and figure out what I wanted to do next. The great Kabuki was very loyal to me and left the Texas booking office shortly after I was gone. He went back to Los Angeles because he had just bought a home with the money he made in Texas, and he also wanted to give me time to decide where our next move would be. I felt that since I had great success with the great Kabuki in Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, that we could have the same impact in the Carolinas. Jimmy Crockett was someone who I had met several times at the Alliance meetings, talked to on the phone over the years, and considered a friend of mine. I had also left on very good terms with his father a decade ago, so I called Jimmy up to see if there were any openings in the Carolinas, and made it clear I wanted to come in as the great Kabuki's manager, and not as a booker. Jimmy couldn't have been more gracious, and told me that he would be thrilled to have us. It was actually quite a big deal to be able to get into the Mid-Atlantic territory that quickly, because there was such a long waiting list for other wrestlers to get in. At the time, there were 2 territories with such sought-after spots that they actually had waiting lists to get into, the WWF and the Mid-Atlantic area. I flew into the Carolinas in March 1983 to start hyping the Great Kabuki's arrival on television interviews. Jim Barnett even sent me tapes of the Great Kabuki's matches from TBS, and Crockett's production crew made a video montage of them, and I presented it as something that I had prepared. The video was great, and really showed the theatrics, the mystery, and the danger of the Great Kabuki. I brought my wife and 2 sons with me, and we moved into a beautiful hotel in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina called the Ocean Plaza. My boys never minded changing schools, and accepted the fact that if they wanted us to live as a family unit, all 4 of us together every day and every night, then they would have to move to where Dad worked. Of course, it helped that they were always in first-class surroundings, but they were always good sports. We would spend our evenings watching movies on cable TV, and one movie my boys just loved was Mel Brooks's History of the World Part 1. My wife didn't want me letting the boys watch it because it was so dirty, but I pointed out that they weren't even understanding the dirty jokes, and that they just liked laughing at the silliness. I was a cool dad though. During this time, Motley Crue's album, Shout at the Devil, was big, and Jason fell in love with that band. People would actually warn me that if I allowed him to listen to Motley Crue it would make him crazy, but I ignored all of that gobbledygook, and learned to appreciate the Crue and other bands that my sons liked during that time, such as AC/DC. Living on Myrtle Beach, my boys kept begging me to take them to the ocean, but my wife wouldn't allow it, because Jason was 5 and Chad was 3. However, they kept asking me, so I waited until my wife went out one day, and then I got some little vests, arm floats, things to put over their noses, and goggles. I dressed them up, we went down to the ocean. I took their hands and asked, "Are you sure you boys want to do this?" They couldn't have been more sure, so we started walking out really slowly, and would get hit by the waves and fall down. We would get up, keep walking out, and sometimes we would make it past the breakers. Then I would let them go and the waves would take them back to shore. They were kicking their little feet, having the greatest time. When my wife came back, she was very upset with me for taking the boys into the ocean. She didn't know that they had been wearing lots of protective devices, because by the time she got home, the only things left were the vests and the arm floats. After my wife calmed down, we had a little lunch and the boys took a nap. At about 5 p.m., Jason and Chad asked if they could go into the hotel pool. I told them they could, but that they had to put their floats on. They did as they were told, and we all jumped in the pool and started swimming. They were getting in and out of the pool, and as they kept jumping in, they would lose one arm float here and there, and before they knew it, the floats were completely off. Because of that, they had learned how to dog paddle without even realizing it. That was a great day in my life, the day I taught my 2 little boys how to swim. We would also visit Wilmington Beach in North Carolina, or head up to the Blue Ridge Parkway for a ride. It ran from Winchester, Virginia to Asheville, North Carolina, and at sundown, as we would drive around the mountain, it would get dark, but as we'd come around the bend, it would suddenly be daylight again. My boys would excitedly ask me how that just happened, and I would reply, because Daddy's a magician. Living in the Carolinas afforded us opportunities to visit Chimney Rock, Maggie Valley, the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, and the Smoky Mountains, which are one of the most beautiful, angelic places on earth, and I've been in a lot of places. If you've never been to the Carolinas, do yourself a favor and go. It is the most scenic and wonderful place that I ever lived in, and I can't say enough about the fabulous time I spent there. Jason was 5 and Chad was 3, yet they still speak fondly of those memories. My children were living very differently than I did during my childhood, because I never traveled more than 6 blocks from where I lived until I was a teenager. I understood that they were having a different upbringing, and I enjoyed that. I wanted them to experience life, To be able to see and do other things, realize that every place doesn't look like Texas, and understand that there are beaches and mountains out there. I wanted them to see all that, rather than just grow up in a microcosm like I did in a neighborhood of 6 blocks. Also, it was important to me for my sons to experience what my life was, with all the things that came with it, especially the travel and the enhancement of being able to experience different places. That's the one thing I gave my children that they appreciate more than anything else. I was so happy and fortunate to have my family with me in the Carolinas. A lot of guys didn't take their families with them when they went to a new territory, and just left them at home. That's why there have been so many divorces and problems with children of wrestlers, because the husband and father was gone for 9 months out of the year. I was different, and never felt it was an inconvenience to take my family on the road with me. I do recognize that not all wrestlers were privileged to have that opportunity, especially the underneath guys, but I was one of the fortunate ones, and I took advantage of it. In retrospect, the time I spent in the Carolinas was the happiest time that I ever had, simply because I was having so much fun with my family every day. After the great Kabuki and I were there for a couple of months and pretty well indoctrinated in the territory, Jimmy Crockett called me and asked me to come to his office for a meeting. When I walked into his office, I saw Ernie Ladd and Wahoo McDaniel, who were both wrestling in the Carolinas at the time, and Dory Funk, who was the booker. Once we were all there, Jimmy started the meeting, and told us that he was going to be upgrading the way he did his TVs. The Mid-Atlantic Territory used to bicycle a tape around the Carolinas. On the tape would be one TV show, and it would be mailed around and played on 50 television stations in 17 different markets over a period of 4 months. Therefore, whatever angle was on that tape was new every time it played in a different city, and it automatically became the main event in that town. Therefore, the booker could use the same matches over and over in different towns for 4 months, because they were always new and fresh, and could tweak them as he went along. Also, he would only have to shoot 3 big angles a year, and just follow the tapes around. Jimmy explained that he was bringing everything current, which would make it more difficult for one booker to take care of the territory on his own. Dory could no longer simply follow a tape around booking the same matches, and would need some help. Not only would he need creative ideas on how to develop and present programs, including 2 solid angles a week, but there was going to be a lot more attention to detail required to book the Carolinas effectively. By no means am I suggesting that Dory wasn't a capable booker. It's just that the Carolinas were so big that it was considered a mega territory. It was far bigger than Texas, because it operated in 3 states, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. Dory had 100 wrestlers on his roster, while other booking offices in Texas, Florida, and Georgia didn't have anything close to that. To boot, Dory had an arrangement with Baba to regularly tour Japan and supply him with talent, so Dory wore many hats during this time period, and was swamped. Jimmy asked Wahoo, Ernie, and I if we would help Dory book the territory, and when we all agreed to, he shared his idea with us. Dory would still be the booker of the entire territory, but we would each be given a state, and would be responsible for the booking duties in our own respective states. He made it clear that these were not assistant booker jobs, we would be the actual booker for each state, and for our new responsibilities, Ernie, Wahoo, and I would be paid an additional $500 a week and given health benefits. I was assigned to run North Carolina, Ernie would handle South Carolina, and Wahoo would be responsible for Virginia. Everything we did, of course, had to be approved by Dory. We were also each given a crew of wrestlers that we would book exclusively, and would only have to worry about booking them in our assigned state. Even though we were given a nucleus crew of guys who would draw us money on a nightly basis, they could be interchanged. For example, if Ernie wanted one of my guys for a night, and I wanted one of his guys, we could trade back and forth. This was nothing that the fans would have been aware of, and the states were not considered separate brands, if you know what I mean. The reason Jimmy had asked us to help Dory out was because we all had solid track records. I had proven myself as a booker in Florida, Georgia, and Texas, while Ernie had booked successfully for Bill Watts Mid-South Wrestling, and Wahoo had booked for Joe Blanchard's Southwest Championship Wrestling. Yes, not too long ago Wahoo and I were bookers for competing promotions in the heat of a bitter war, but there were no hard feelings, and there was never any animosity between us, because it was never a personal issue, and we understood that. Dory Funk, as well as Jimmy and David Crockett and the booking assistant, Gene Anderson, would meet with me, Ernie, and Wahoo twice a week, once to go over the live shows, and the other time to go over TV production. The 7 of us would sit down at a big, round conference table and discuss our booking ideas for our respective states. I was always pretty well prepared, but Ernie and Wahoo weren't. They liked to just come in and throw out ideas during the round table discussion. I preferred having my ideas, and where I was going, all laid out in front of me. Therefore, I did most of my work at night when my family was sleeping, and I would bring those notes into the meetings. In spite of our different work styles, Ernie, Wahoo, and I got along just fine. And even though we were more or less left alone in regards to the programs that we wanted to do, we helped each other out as much as we could. For example, I was running a hot feud between Jimmy Valiant and the Great Kabuki, and every night the Great Kabuki would blow Jimmy green. During one of our meetings, Ernie suggested, "Gary, why don't you give Jimmy some protection from the green mist to add a little excitement?" That was a great idea, so I got together with Jimmy Valiant, and we talked about what kind of protection he could use. Jimmy then went out and got a pair of goggles, but they were big ones, like a sea diver would wear. Then, during his interviews, he dared the Great Kabuki to blow him green, and pulled out his protection. That really drew great, and we were able to prolong the Great Kabuki-Jimmy Valiant feud. Without Ernie's suggestion, it would have done okay, but I'm sure they wouldn't have had the run they had. Then there was an angle that Wahoo was booking in which he and Mark Youngblood were involved in a feud with the Assassins. The Assassins' manager, Paul Jones, would constantly hit Wahoo and Mark with his cane, so a series of matches were booked where Wahoo would wrestle Paul. Their feud didn't draw as well as Wahoo would have thought, so I went to one of his shows to see if I could help out. During their match, I noticed that the fans kept looking to the back, seemingly waiting for the Assassins to run in and save their manager. I picked up on that and talked Wahoo into rebooking their match. But this time I suggested he make it a lumberjack match, and give all the lumberjacks canes. That way, all the babyfaces who had been hit by Paul Jones would be there to exact revenge. Those are just two examples of how we worked together and tweaked each other's angles for the betterment of the entire territory. Ernie suggested something great for my state, and I helped Wahoo out in his. All three of us worked really well together, and Dory and Jimmy were wonderful to report to. It was a good working relationship, and I must say it all went very smoothly. On top of booking the entire territory, Dory was also wrestling throughout the Carolinas, and he asked me if I would serve as his manager. Needless to say, I was more than happy to manage him, and jumped at the chance. This was during a time when Dory was clearly wrestling under a mask, and we went out to the ring and acted as if nobody knew it was him. I also managed Ernie Ladd, referring to him as my bounty hunter, so for a while not only was I booking North Carolina, but I was also managing the booker of South Carolina as well as the head booker for the entire Mid-Atlantic area. To say I was kept busy would be an understatement. I must say that I had a pretty decent crew to work with in North Carolina with guys like Jake Roberts, Mike Rotundo, Baron Von Rasht, Ronnie Garvin, and Angelo Mosca. Sergeant Slaughter was also there, and he was big time over and very gracious to me. Slaughter is a great guy and a quality man in every way, and I have nothing but respect for him. Another guy on my crew was Sir Oliver Humperdinck, and it occurred to me that together, we could resurrect Hand H. Limited, but this time it would be named after Humperdinck and Hart. Together, we shared a terrific stable of wrestlers, including the Great Kabuki, the One-Man Gang, and Jos Leduc. Sir Oliver lived down the road from me during that time, and I spent a lot of time visiting with him and relaxing in his hot tub, just having a great time with my buddy. In July of 1983, we staged a big show at Exhibition Stadium in Toronto. A lot of wrestlers forget about Canada, but Canada was a great place to work, and I love that country. We did tapings out of Ottawa and Hamilton, so I spent quite a bit of time in Canada during my Mid-Atlantic run. When it came to international bookings, Dory was the man in charge, and he is the one who booked that big show at Exhibition Stadium in which the Great Kabuki faced Jimmy Valiant. I was then booked on the return, teaming with the Great Kabuki against Jimmy Valiant and Bob Orton in a cage match. Because of my position in the office, I was privy to a lot of behind-the-scenes deals and maneuverings. At one point, Jimmy Crockett wanted to bring Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen into the Mid-Atlantic territory in order to win the NWA World Tag Team title. I was asked to broker the deal, not because I was booking North Carolina, but because of my longtime connection with Brody. It was felt that I could have some influence on bringing him in, because we had worked so long together in Texas. I spoke to Brody about coming into the Carolinas, and when he asked me my opinion, I told him that Jimmy Crockett and the Carolinas were great, and then added, in all honesty, I don't think that this will be a situation where you and Stan can just take dates here in between your tours of Japan, like you did with me in Texas. Jimmy wants to put the belts on you. Brody was intrigued, so he and Stan flew into Charlotte to have a meeting with Jimmy, Dory, and me. We all talked about it and tried to work out a deal, but because of their commitments in Japan, it just wasn't possible. The Carolinas was such a big territory that for them to work for us just 6 months out of the year would not have worked. The odd thing about this was that Dory was their booker in Japan. He was the booker of both Mid-Atlantic and All Japan at the time, and was basically trying to recruit talent from one of his groups to another. Being the booker for North Carolina also gave me the opportunity to bring the Von Erich boys into the Carolinas. All three of them made several trips to North Carolina during my run, and they were constantly asking me to go to the ring and manage them. Of course, I never did, because word would have gotten back to Texas via the wrestling dirt sheets, but it would have been great to manage the Von Erich boys as